I sort of implied in the previous video that a strict division of places into cities, towns and villages is a UK-specific phenomenon. Woe betide you if you call the city of Ely or the village of Kidlington a town. You're being categorically incorrect, and the people who live there will shove that information in your face till you choke on it. It's not that common for languages to have three distinct words that map nicely onto the three in English, but there are still a fair few countries which make the distinction anyway, language be damned, between special honorary settlements, normal settlements, and small settlements. I'm going to be focusing on Europe in this video, for which I have no excuses. Maybe I'll look at other parts of the world in a future video. For now, I need a limited range so I know when to stop. Also, this is not academically rigorous. I'm not from any of these places and I will no doubt get some details wrong. I'm just rabbiting on about something I found interesting lately. My citations are all various language versions of Wikipedia. Complain if you wish. Ireland is of course largely English speaking and used to be a British colony, and so you'd imagine that the part of it that isn't still under the boot of the Empire would distinguish between cities and towns. And of course they do. There are 6 cities in the Republic, and straight away you can tell that they are far less densely packed than the ones in the UK, even compared to the ones north of the border on the same island. Fundamentally, cities in Ireland are a totally different category to those in the UK. For one, cathedrals have nothing to do with it. Ireland has way more than 6 cathedrals, but since the settlements those cathedrals find themselves in are mostly tiny and have always been tiny, the idea of treating them all as cities never caught on. For 2, it's not just a ceremonial title, it's an actually practical term. Apart from Kilkenny, which takes great delight in breaking the pattern, an Irish city is somewhere which essentially acts as a county by itself, with the local county council having no authority. And, again, apart from Kilkenny, Ireland's cities are the 5 biggest places in the Republic. Cashel in County Tipperary used to be a city, but it was deemed too small, and now isn't one. Contrast that with Armagh in the northern part of the same island, which is only 2/3 the size of Kilkenny, and was named a city as recently as 1994. Even if they speak the same language and use the same word, 2 countries' concepts of a city can be radically different. This will only get worse when other languages come into play. Our next closest neighbour is France, where the idea of city status is completely absent. As far as I can make out, even before the revolution there was no formal practice of giving honorary status or privileges to certain important towns, and if certain towns had been given certain privileges at some point, that doesn't necessarily mean they can be compared to each other directly, that they formed a group or fitted into a system. And if such a system did at some point exist, evidently no one cared enough about it to mention it to a Wikipedia editor. Since the revolution, every settlement in France has been essentially equal. They're all just communes, and you can call somewhere a ville or a village based on what feels right. The word cité does exist in French, but these days people generally use it to talk in a semi-pejorative way about high-density housing developments, or sometimes about the historic centres of towns, as in the Ile de la Cité in Paris. Both this and the English word come from the Latin civitas, a word which seems to have changed its meaning quite a lot over time. At first it just meant citizenship, being a citizen of somewhere, as opposed to someone that somewhere's busy oppressing. Then it must have broadened out also to mean citizens collectively, the citizenry, and to mean the stuff that goes with being a citizen, law and order, the state, civilization, and it started to refer to the place you find citizens, the place the power of the state is felt most strongly and the outlaws and barbarians are kept in check, the area around a city. Nations outside the empire had their own civitates, of course, but once they were conquered, their local ruling class were Romanized and kept in check by Roman officials, bringing civilization with them. Civitas and its descendants eventually replaced the Latin word urbs as the normal way of talking about cities, but you can see from this background just how much cultural and historic baggage comes built into such a normal, faceless word. Cities are not a culturally neutral idea. Early on in Christianity, they were very keen on making sure that churches, wherever they met, were within reach of a supervisor, overseer, a bishop. So, as best as I can make out, they'd try to get one bishop in each Roman city in order to distribute them evenly. Now, a bishop needs somewhere to sit, a chair, if you will, and really there should be somewhere to put that chair, so you always know where to find it. Let's say in a church. These are bishops after all. And oh wait, look, we've just invented the cathedral, and there just so happens to be one in each city. You can see how that association came about. It's just odd that Britain was the only place to actually make it official. Here's an aside I probably should delete from the script. Although the actual buildings come and go, cathedrals can stay in the same place for a very long time. In France, the distribution of cathedrals is supposed to map fairly closely onto the old Roman cities, and while some bishops did move to neighbouring towns within their remit, within their diocese, and some dioceses are definitely medieval or later, I do think this is correct. In the south and east, closer to Rome and civilization, they're packed extremely close together, even in places which have quite a low population these days. The density goes way down further out, into the periphery of the empire. It's quite a pretty pattern, really. Anyway, no, in France, a cathedral does not make a city. Not even the fiercest French Catholic will tell you that Saint-Lizier is a city and Mulhouse isn't. For English speakers who want to know which places in France to call cities instead of towns, please feel free to ignore this list I came up with. Italy was where the Roman Empire started, and you can bet your life that boot still has a city or two, città, civitas, from that time. In fact, there's loads, places that have been called cities since before anyone bothered to check. And local rulers didn't hesitate to add to their number any town that seemed mildly important at the time. Now, because a città does not stop being a città, unless I suppose it's completely deserted, a lot of them are small and some are tiny. For instance, here is the ancient city of Santa Lucia del Mela in Sicily, and here it is next to Bristol. Or, for an extreme example, here's the 16th century city of Civitella del Tronto near the Adriatic coast, next to the famously puny St David's. It should go without saying that many of these places wouldn't have been considered tiny in their heyday, back when there were far fewer people, and almost all of them lived in the countryside. But even as the cultural idea of urban developed to exclude smaller settlements, the idea of the city seems not to have done. Because of all this, the Italian concept of a city is far less exclusive and special than the British one. You might even say that town is a more accurate translation. It's not as if literally every single place can become a city, but any one of them certainly could. The thing about making new cities is that every time you do it, you subtly change the overall concept. You might start off with, say, 30 cities in a country, 20 of them quite big and 10 small. The absolute definition of big and small isn't important, as it will naturally change over time. Population goes up and demographics shift, but there will always be bigger and smaller settlements. In this situation, a city is one of a very select set of localities, probably quite a big one, but not necessarily. You might want a new city candidate to be on the larger side, but in fact it can be anywhere at all within that range, or possibly just outside it. There are always going to be more small settlements than big settlements in an area, so eventually you will have promoted all the big places to cityhood, and the average bigness of a city will start to go down as more are added. So the number of places that look similar to actual cities, that seem like blatantly obvious candidates for promotion, will go up, subtly shifting the concept of a city until eventually. This process is extremely slow. Most countries won't have had the same category of city status for nearly long enough to make that much difference. Italy, however, has been at it for millennia, and would you look at that, they've added over 340 new cities in the last 25 years. The word's lost all meaning. The wiki page I got this from goes out of its way to mention that it's an incomplete list. It took me no time at all to find one they missed. Palestrina, city since forever, apparently. Oh, and what does city status bestow upon a town? They get to put a fancy golden crown on top of their coat of arms. Also, it turns out that in Italy you can call certain places both a city and a village, borgo, interchangeably, and that's considered correct. Suppose it makes sense when cities are next to impossible to keep track of. If you want to come up with a concept for Italian cities that can be directly compared to the British one, places with cathedrals is another bad place to start. Limiting it to just cathedrals that are the head of a diocese, that's still 218-ish places, many very small, one for every 1,400 square kilometres, more than twice the density you get in the UK. Including places with co-cathedrals and former cathedrals, it starts to look as if you've picked up every town in the country. My headcanon has 118 cities, meticulously picked based purely on vibe, and you don't care. Spain seems to have done things a bit like Italy in that most towns of any importance were made cities, ciudades, and so they're on average much closer together and much smaller than I as a Brit am used to. Two main differences. Most of Spain has a much lower population density than Italy, so you get some pretty big gaps. And unlike in Italy, there hasn't been any huge surge in the numbers recently. In fact, only one city's been added to the list in the last 60 years, so the title hasn't completely lost its significance. As with any good city status system, there are a couple of glaringly obvious omissions whose absurdity lends the whole thing a sort of arcane, unfathomable quality. On the north coast, Bilbao and Gijón are easily the biggest settlements in their respective regions, the Basque Country and Asturias, and both have to get by as villas, roughly towns. Plus, the city of Madrid isn't one. And it's not like London, two small cities surrounded by a whole lot of not that. There is simply no city in Madrid, or in any of the biggish towns that orbit it, until you get out to Alcalá de Henares. This is inexcusable and unexplainable. Madrid's been Spain's big, important capital since the 16th century. The royals live there, for pity's sake. You know, the people who decide what should and shouldn't be a city. I suppose we have to call it a capital town. You cannot understand the joy this nonsense brings me. In reality, Spaniards call basically everything a ciudad, regardless of its status. So, never mind, I guess. Here's my headcanon. You won't be surprised to learn that Portugal did things similarly to Spain. It was, after all, one of the many kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, and just happened to remain independent instead of uniting with Castile. Through the centuries, Portugal was a bit more conservative about what to include than Spain, with 2,300 square kilometres per city as opposed to Spain's 1,850. As of 1970, then, in the 70s, they got rid of the fash. This is something I recommend to everyone. One of the least consequential things the new government did was redefine what makes a ciudad. The result was that they essentially pulled an Italy. Today, Portugal has more than half the number of cities Spain has in a fifth of the area. This seems like the sort of thing that should annoy me, but actually, no, it doesn't. That's because their new definition is quite sensible. Sensible thing number one, it's settlements that can become cities, not municipalities. In Calabria, in Italy, there are two towns called Corigliano and Rossano. Not only do both of them have old towns that are completely separate from their new towns, they also have 6 miles of countryside separating each other. But, since they're within the same municipality, together with the coastal town of Schiavonia, they are one city. This is silly and bad and won't happen in Portugal. Sensible thing number two, no new city can have less than 8,000 inhabitants. It's worth keeping in mind that this number refers to the actual settlement, not the municipality. You can't have a town of 5,000 with 3,000 people living in the surrounding countryside and expect it to count, and you won't get an Atrani or a Rocamandolfi becoming a city in Portugal. Maybe 8,000 is a bit on the low end for a population limit. On the other hand, it makes sense in terms of getting the old cities to feel consistent with the new ones. Traditional cities like Lamego and Silves don't seem out of place next to modern ones like Peso de Régua and Ourén. Also, I had a couple of cities smaller than that in my last video, so maybe I should move on to sensible thing number 3. A city must have a decent amount of infrastructure, which means at least 5 of the items on this list. Ideally, this should exclude places that are purely dormitory towns or suburbs, places where the inhabitants are constantly having to go into the nearest city to do anything. In fact, plenty of suburbs of Lisbon and Porto are called cities, but I can only assume that just means Portugal is alright at local infrastructure. To be blunt, I headcanon the older list of cities, but I do appreciate what they're going for. The Maltese language has the word belt for both city and town, but they also speak English there, which of course distinguishes between the two concepts. City status isn't currently a legal thing in Malta like it is in some other countries, but that's just allowed the traditional list of cities to become unchangeable and definitive. For somewhere so small, it's got a huge number of them. One for every 29 square kilometres of land area goes well beyond anywhere else I'm aware of, not counting city-states. And for somewhere so densely populated, the shape of each city is surprisingly well defined by the geography. These three little ones are practically touching, but it's instantly clear where one begins and another ends. The setting of a tiny island country totally recontextualises my idea of a city. This feels completely normal and correct to me. Without any immediate foreign neighbours to compare them to, suddenly I don't care how small and how close together these cities all are. Relative to the space they have to play with, they're perfectly sensible. It's interesting how my brain works this way. So, how come the idea of what a city is should be so much more exclusive and picky in Britain and Ireland than anywhere else? I think it simply comes down to the Romans. Britannia was a remote outpost of the empire. Its erstwhile Celtic rulers weren't particularly interested in urbanisation, and its conquerors don't seem to have felt much need to push it either. Something like 45 places in Britannia warranted the name Givitas, while in Lycia, a mountainous area of Turkey about the size of East Anglia, that number was at least 25. While towns became bigger and more important in Roman-obsessed medieval Europe, the classical Givitas remained in people's minds. In Italy, most towns fitted into that category. In Britain, only a few of them did, and so that single shared concept began to diverge. With that, I've run out of countries that use descendants of the Latin word Givitas for a special category of places. Germany and Switzerland have no distinction between cities and towns. Everything bigger than a village is just a Stadt. But if you want to think of a city as just a town with some special status, then you have a few options. In Germany, at least. In Switzerland, you're on your own, mate. Switzerland headcanon, by the way. The states of Germany are subdivided into Kreise, which are roughly equivalent to counties. Many larger towns are administered separately from their county, and if you were following the Irish definition, that would make them cities. An English speaker would be perfectly justified in calling all these places cities and everywhere else in Germany towns, but I'm pretty sure no one does that. This definition also misses out places like Paderborn, Saarbrücken and Konstanz, which I think most English speakers would intuitively think of as cities, while separately including most of the areas in the Ruhr metropolis, which I wouldn't. If you like your city's definitions historical, you could do worse than the free imperial cities of the Holy Roman Empire. These were basically city-states, not ruled by a duke or a prince or a bishop or a king or whatever, but nearly independent, under the direct authority of the emperor. By the end of the empire in the late 18th century, all of these were in present-day Germany, though a few former ones ended up in Switzerland, France, the Netherlands and Latvia. Looking at the map, this is not a comprehensive definition for a German city. Most of these are concentrated in the southwest. The northeast is completely barren. Berlin and Munich and Dresden and Bielefeld are ignored. Actually, that last one's understandable. It's easy to ignore a place that doesn't quite exist. I speculate that the emperors would probably have liked to have more free imperial cities in these areas, but powerful states like Saxony or Brandenburg could just tell him no. In the southwest, there were loads of very small, presumably very amenable states, and so there ended up being a lot of small independent cities. Maybe. For a more north-centric German city status, why not try the Hanseatic League? Okay, this isn't specific to Germany, but it was centred on Germany, with its capital in Lübeck. In the late Middle Ages, this was a confederation of cities that crossed political boundaries and worked towards the shared aim of making lots of money. Together they controlled a good chunk of the trade that went on all over Europe, so you can bet that these all count as historically important cities. It's stuff like the Hanseatic League that you can thank for the eventual rise of capitalism if you're in a free market, eat the poor mood. Combine this lot with the free imperial cities, and all the big cities that got missed out, and hey, might as well include everywhere with a cathedral and everywhere with an old university and all the obvious places you missed, and I'm getting carried away here, aren't I? The Netherlands! The main word here is Stad, which, as you might remember from Germany, can be translated as either city or town. But since Stad is a historic honorary title, and there are plenty of Dutch towns which have never received it, Heerlen, Apeldoorn, Hengelo, Almere, Emmen, Bussen and so on, I think we can tentatively say that we've got a city situation on our hands. About time we wash those hands, we'll be spreading city gunk all over the shop if we're not careful. Tons of cities were created in the 1200s, the 1300s, the 1400s, many of them very small, but often fortified with moats and ramparts nevertheless. Some of them genuinely just normal villages that someone important once promoted to city in view of sweeping ambitions for the place that never came to pass. After this, new additions slowed down considerably, and by the time the Netherlands became an independent country in 1581, the list was essentially complete. When in the 19th century city-status had stopped carrying the practical importance and the privileges it once had, they went back and started filling in a few gaps in the list, most notably The Hague, but also places like Tilburg, Osse, Zaandam, then promptly abolished cities, so what was the point of that? Today, whether something has been a city or not is completely irrelevant in the Netherlands, but I have no doubt that there are some tiny former cities that are extremely possessive of their former title. In Belgium and Luxembourg, the cities are at the same extremely high density as in the Netherlands. They were generally created during the same period as those in the Netherlands. This is a single ancient system inherited by 3 modern countries that simply didn't exist at the time. Difference being, city status is still legal in Belgium and Luxembourg, and Belgium at least is still accepting offers. Historical city privileges were abolished in Belgium when it was occupied by France after the French Revolution. City privileges are of course not a thing in France, and they seem like the sort of thing that the new Republican ideology would have detested, but some places apparently retained an honorary title of ville during this time. After Napoleon was defeated, Belgium was briefly part of an independent Netherlands, and in 1825 they went and made a codified list of the places that were thenceforth count as cities. Wikipedia isn't forthcoming about which cities had been abolished during the French occupation and were reinstated at that time, but apparently there were some. What is certain is that some historic cities didn't end up on this list. Places such as Vilvoorde, Gistel, Stockholm, Herentals, and were only restored relatively recently. Anyway, this new city status is tied to municipalities, not to actual settlements, and in Belgium, municipalities often encompass several towns and villages. So, presumably, certain places could be barred from having their medieval city status restored due to being in the same municipality as an existing city. And you don't get the same ridiculously tiny cities as you do in the Netherlands. Derby, supposedly Belgium's smallest, incorporates a much larger area and far more people than its traditional limits. And you don't end up with the same incredibly high density of cities that you see in certain parts of the Netherlands. What happens when 2 municipalities merge into one? Back in January, the cities of Tongeren and Borloon were incorporated into a single municipality. Does that mean they're a single city now? Does this new municipality have to be granted city status all over again now its parents no longer exist? Probably someone has thought about this at some point, but I'm pretty sure no one actually cares. Anyway, this is my headcanon for the Low Countries. The Swedish word for a city is stad, identical to the Dutch word in spelling and meaning and just as obsolete. The Swedish concept matches up with the British one slightly better than the Dutch one does. There are no really tiny städer. While the Netherlands has the city of Stafrede, really just a hamlet with a castle, Sweden's smallest, Marstrand, is the same size as Britain's smallest, St David's, but they're much smaller on average than British cities, with the median stad, Härnösand, only being bigger than 7 UK cities at 18,000. They're also twice as densely packed, if you discount Norrland, the less populated northern part of the country, with 1 per 1,600 square kilometres as opposed to 3,200 in the UK. The opposite of what I would expect for somewhere with a lot less people. But I think it's a fairly close analogue, all things considered. The historic list of städer hasn't been a legal thing since the 70s, so it's got an air of definitiveness and isn't tethered to municipalities. There's several historic cities that have become indistinguishable from Stockholm, plus a couple of other similar cases, but if you ignore these, it's quite a pleasing system. Finland has distinguished between what is essentially a town, Kauppala, and what is essentially a city, Kaupunki, for a couple of centuries. As Finland was a Swedish colony in medieval times, Sweden introduced their own concept of the stad to Finland, where it eventually got translated into the Kaupunki. So, most of Finland's traditional cities are near the coast, places that it took Swedish settlers less time to reach. Swedish is still widely spoken in a lot of these cities. City status was, well into the 20th century, not a symbolic, honorary thing at all. In fact, it carried with it a whole chunk of extra obligations that towns didn't have to follow, including lots of legal stuff I don't quite understand. Starting in the 60s, these obligations were scrapped for new cities, and lots of towns were promoted until, at the end of 1977, there were none left to promote. So Finland abolished towns, and in so doing removed the last modicum of specialness from the city status, rendering cities normal, turning every last one into just another town. I wonder whether Finland will ever come up with a special honorary status for certain towns, invent city status again, and start the whole cycle anew. Keep an eye out for that. Here's where I suggest they start. Norway, which started to urbanise fairly late, had a pretty close equivalent to the Swedish Stad. This status had nothing to do with royal importance or political autonomy or cathedrals or whatever. It was purely based on commerce and trade and business. Norwegian cities were simply the places where that happened. The sellouts of the medieval European city status world. But I guess it's honest from an anthropological perspective. Since the 50s, every city and town in Norway has just been called a by, and villages can apply to be included on the list based on municipal population. Not the population of the village itself, the population of the municipality the village is in. Despite the fact that it's the village and not the municipality that gets the status, and a municipality is allowed to contain more than one by. Anyway, Denmark did used to be part of the same kingdom as Norway, inheriting the same system of cities as regional centres of trade, now also abolished. There are few towns of any size in Denmark that lack the historic status. Exceptions exist, like Jyderup and Grindsted, but these are relatively young towns, products of the railways. The list was still being gradually expanded until its abolition, with upstart railway towns like Herning and Skjern eventually joining their respectable older siblings as cities. I imagine that if the whole thing hadn't been abolished, your Jyderups and Grindsteds would have followed suit before long, along with 7 separate nondescript suburbs of Copenhagen. By the way, headcanon for the Nordics. Scandinavia and the Low Countries all essentially have the same thing going on here, right? We're not quite talking about cities with these countries, as the lists are so inclusive, but there's enough gaps that they can't be considered a straightforward equivalent to towns. It's somewhere in the middle. We're talking about an honorary status given only to certain places that granted them particular privileges that other towns didn't have, only there were way more of them than the idea of city might suggest, and they skewed much smaller. Supposedly, back in the late Middle Ages, you could find this same system all around Europe. It was especially prevalent in the parts of Europe that speak Germanic languages, or were heavily influenced by speakers of Germanic languages. So I'll be calling it Germanic style, or Stad, or something like that. Well, England existed in the Middle Ages, and we just so happen to speak a Germanic language. Surely there's some equivalent to a Stad here. Let's go back to Denmark for a moment. The Danish word for a special honorary kind of settlement, what I've so far been calling a city, is Købstad. This literally translates to market town. England has market towns. England has so many market towns. This map is a visualisation of all the towns in England and Wales with markets that some guy could think of in 1722. There's no definitive list. Spaced roughly 6 miles apart, because that was the law, they cover almost the whole country. No one would ever say these were all cities, but I don't think that they're a great parallel to the Stad either. Stads had an amount of autonomy, they were often fortified, there were special privileges according to people who lived there. Market towns were allowed to hold markets, and really that was about it. And it's hard to find an old town here that hasn't at some point had a market. Even somewhere like Crewe, which didn't even exist before the railways arrived, holds outdoor markets. There's nothing special about them, they're just towns. So England doesn't really have an equivalent to the Germanic-style Stad thing, but Scotland absolutely does. The two nations have only been part of the same country for 300 years. Before the UK existed, city status seems to have been far less formalised in the Kingdom of Scotland than in the Kingdom of England. The idea of the royal borough was far more defined. Like the Stad, it was a status granted by the monarch that gave a town certain privileges. There were plenty of towns without the status, but it was far less exclusive than the English-style city, and royal boroughs were generally much smaller. Every Scottish city is also a royal borough, as are some very small towns like New Galloway and Falkland, plus Rattray in Aberdeenshire, which doesn't even exist anymore. There's also some surprising omissions, such as Falkirk, Paisley and Dunblane. It's obsolete, right? Legally, it doesn't matter. But many royal boroughs are still very proud of their former status. If Scotland had remained an independent country, Would they have adopted a formal English-style city status, or would the royal borough have remained the be-all and end-all? Would a parallel version of myself be attempting to argue that you, the viewer, should be thinking of them as fundamentally the same thing as a stad in Sweden or the Netherlands? Essentially, cities? There are several categories of settlement in Poland that Wiki groups together as cities, despite the fact that cities and towns are both called miasto in Polish. Every municipality with a population over 100,000, every municipality governed as a county in its own right, as we've seen in Ireland and Germany, every municipality that has acted as the capital of a province, including obsolete ones, some other places, all these categories overlap to create a complicated Venn diagram that no one on earth cares about. The one thing they all have in common is that the mayor of these places has a special title. While town mayors are lumped with the Germanic Burmistrz as a title, same as German Bürgermeister, city mayors get to be dubbed Präsident, Latinate and sophisticated, as befits a Civitas, that bulwark of civilization against barbaric hordes. Do I actually think the Polish government were invoking Roman-era xenophobia and classism when they chose to make this distinction between a Burmistrz and a Präsident? No, obviously not. But it's interesting to me how the idea of Latin equals important has persisted for such a long time. Taken as a group, the cities of Poland feel about right to me. 1 per 2,900 square kilometres, nicely spread out around the country. Everywhere I'd intuitively expect to be included is accounted for, barring a few historically significant smaller towns such as Wolin and Sandomierz. And while Polish cities skew slightly lower in population, there are very few left-field inclusions. There is an area of particularly high city density in Silesia, in a continuous urban corridor centred on the city of Katowice, and this, predictably, grinds one or two of my gears. I'm going to try and explain why this sort of thing bothers me, why it so drastically goes against my personal idea of what a city is. It's not just that it looks messy on a map, although I can't deny that does play a part. It's that they're one blob. You don't leave one city and then enter a different one. You just find yourself having already slid into it with no hint as to when or why it happened. Should these places count as separate cities because they have their own separate central districts? The old bit of town where the shops are? Even ignoring the fact that one of them, Ruda Śląska, seems not to really have one of these, that still doesn't quite sell it for me. Take Stoke-on-Trent, for instance. 6-ish separate central districts, but still pretty unambiguously a single city. Is it that these places are all self-governing? Well, the wards of Tokyo, Shinjuku, Shibuya, Setagaya, and so on, are all governed separately, at the same level as cities in other parts of the country, and yet we consider Tokyo to be one city. I don't see why there couldn't be a similar arrangement in Poland. Is it that they all originated as separate towns which just happened to meld together as the population grew? Well, again, accepting Ruda Śląska, which isn't very old and seems to have been founded as a suburb, that's no doubt true. But it's also inevitable that as a city expands, it will engulf neighbouring towns. At a certain point, they tend to just be seen as districts of the city. Take Croydon or Kingston in London, or indeed Kraków and the formerly separate cities of Klepasz, Kazimierz and Podgórze. When two merging towns are similarly sized and are centred on points that are quite far apart, it's more likely that they'll retain separate identities and function like separate urban areas. Dallas and Fort Worth, or Guangzhou and Foshan, or I suppose Wolverhampton and Birmingham, with apologies to the Black Country. And in cases like that, I tend to be on the side of that's two cities. I don't know which of the places around Katowice that framework applies to. Presumably Gliwice, at least, probably Sosnowiec, Zabrze, Bytom. If you happen to be from the area, please eviscerate me in the comments. At the end of the day, if these places are considered cities, then cities they are, and no amount of outcry from a disgruntled foreigner is going to change that fact. There was a totally unrelated concept of royal city several centuries ago during the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, covering most of Poland and Lithuania plus Belarus, most of Ukraine and parts of Russia. And there were loads of them. Similarly to the Holy Roman Empire's free imperial cities, these were accountable directly to the monarch rather than being under some local lord. And that wasn't just an arbitrary distinction. Citizens of these places were given extra rights and privileges such as representation in Parliament and the possibility of being promoted to nobility. It looks like many of the royal cities have always been small, because they gained their status from happening to be on royal-owned land, not because of their actual importance. Rzeszów, Gdynia, Brdów, to name three. Meanwhile, many modern cities like Białystok and Rzeszów seem to have never had royal status, despite being surrounded by smaller towns, which did. I like to imagine what would happen if this had lived on into the present day as an official honorary status. Would someone like me be making a condescending YouTube video called Fixing Polish City Status and saying the word cathedral 600 times? No one will ever know. Hungary also had royal free cities for several centuries, and at this point you probably have a good idea of what that meant. Most of them are in modern-day Slovakia and Romania, but there's a good few in Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Ukraine, and, would you believe it, Hungary. None of this means anything in the modern day. Austria, being German-speaking, doesn't have separate words for city and town, but a few Städte are considered statutory. The phrase statutory city sounds enough like city status for me to instantly accept this as exactly the same thing as we have in the UK. There's one per 5,600 square kilometres, which is pretty comparable to the UK if you take into account all those Alps you can't put cities on. The 9 biggest settlements in the country all have the status, as well as a few outliers like Weidhofen an der Ybbs and the especially tiny Rust, but a few larger towns such as Dornbirn and Leoben miss out. With all this put together, you'd imagine it's an old arcane system that survived since before being sensible was invented, like UK city status. It's not that. Austrian statutory cities were created as part of an administrative reshuffle in the mid-19th century, and they're still essentially an administrative category today, with their municipalities having a little bit more power than standard ones, on a level with districts in the rest of the country. Very sensible and boring. So, what's Rust doing on the list? Well, you know how I said that the royal free cities of Hungary meant nothing in the modern day? None of this means anything in the modern day. I was lying. After World War I, Austria and Hungary were well and truly split apart after centuries of pretending to be separate countries. A small area in the west of Hungary that was mainly German-speaking got glued onto Austria, bringing with it 2 royal free cities, Eisenstadt and Rust. What seems to have happened is that the Austrian authorities didn't want to annoy their new citizens in these 2 cities by stripping away their historic privileges, but because there was no equivalent honorary historical title to give them, they just got slotted into the boring administrative one instead. So, because of an archaic title from the days of knights in armour, because of the whim of a forgotten foreign aristocrat from an overthrown aristocracy, Rust, 5 times smaller than any other city in the country, is legally and practically on the same level as Vienna. It's interesting how 2 completely separate ideas of what a city is can so easily be accommodated in the same system. You could almost believe this video had a point. Please tell me if it does or not. It's been a month since I started writing this script and I genuinely can't tell. What is now the Czech Republic was part of Austria when statutory cities were first introduced, so it naturally ended up with some too. This group stuck around after Czechoslovak independence, got drastically trimmed down not long afterwards and was finally binned in the period post-World War II. Then it was reintroduced a couple of decades later after Czech independence, except this time with a new cast and none of the actual legal importance it used to have. There's 3 towns that used to be cities for a brief while, plus a pile of cities in the industrial northwest that hadn't been until quite recently. Everything bigger than 40,000 residents gets the title. The only smaller city, Třinec, did briefly meet that threshold. Prague isn't technically on the modern list, but it may as well be, as the only city to have kept its privileges after the mid-20th century reforms. Austrian city status has a pretty good vibe, but this is uninspiring by comparison. The equivalent of a city in Romania is a municipiu, but most people will just refer to them as towns, orașe, in most contexts. These were a short-lived 20th century invention, abolished at the start of socialism, but Ceausescu brought them back not long afterwards. As with many of these systems, the earlier a city was added to the list, the more likely it is to pass the vibe check. Gradual erosion of the specialness of city status, blah-de-blah-de-blah, you've heard this before. What's interesting to me is that it was decided that treating all these places the same, giving them the same status, wasn't good enough, so they came up with a new category of Tier 1 cities, places that were considered to be of national importance, with everything else getting shoved into Tier 2. The capital Bucharest goes in Tier 0 all by itself. So if, like me, you're way too picky about these things, you can just pretend that This is the list of Romanian cities, and Tier 2 have just been big-ish towns all along. This shorter list is actually just made up of all but 4 of the original pre-1930 municipi. Kind of makes you think they had the right of it first time. Moldova also has municipi, just like its big sister, but they're kind of boring. Latvian city status is sensible and boring. They're called valstspilsētas, which means national towns. It's a recently invented category layered on top of the traditional Germanic-style Stad system that we've seen in Scandinavia and the Low Countries. There's 10 of them. They're the 10 biggest places in the country. It's pretty much like Romanian Tier 1s, only they've got a proper name. Lithuania hasn't come up with a category like this yet. Wiki says it has 103 cities, miestai, but after going through all of them, town seems to me like a much better translation. One of the criteria for miestas status is to have at least 2/3 of the population working in industry or service. But can we really say that somewhere where 1/3 of people work in agriculture is a city? The next category down, miesteliai, Wiki calls towns, but I would say are villages, and what it calls villages, kaimai, are far too numerous to be anything other than hamlets. Listen, Lithuania, come back when you've done Latvia and then we'll talk. Here's my suggestion if you're interested. Serbian city status makes me feel warm and fuzzy. The operative word is grad, and there's 28 of them. They're nicely spaced, they're all quite big by Balkan standards. None of them are just suburbs or even commuter towns as far as I can tell. They're at the perfect density, 1 per 2,800 square kilometres, halfway in between the number for real UK cities and my fake UK cities. It's not just the 28 most populous places in Serbia, there's a little bit more chaos than that, with the cities of Prokuplje and especially Loznica being smaller than a fair few towns. A grad has a bit more autonomy than your standard municipality, so it's not a purely ceremonial title. It does refer to a municipality rather than a settlement, so, as in most countries, the territory of a city can include neighbouring villages, but they do seem to keep track of the actual urban area separately from its rural hinterland, which is nice when you want to look up populations. So, you know what, full marks to Serbia, see me after class. The neat and tidy part of my brain likes that Serbian city status exists as a model example. The rest of my brain revels in the fact that not a single other country agrees with them. Every other country in Europe either doesn't make the distinction or does and it's just boring. But what if this whole thing was just boring all along? Cities aren't a social construct. They're about 100 separate social constructs. I've been trying for a while to work out what point I'm trying to make with this video. Is it a guide for English speakers to decide whether to call somewhere a city or a town? Because it's a bad one of those. Is it about the culturally bound nature of language, the impossibility of exact translation? Is it about the human impulse to categorise things and the inherent changeability of the categories we invent, but how we seem to manage anyway? Or how one government can come up with an idea and their successors can just decide to turn it into something else entirely? Or how historical accidents turn into absolute facts about the world? Or am I just not shutting up about a recent fixation? I mean, it's the last one, but that other stuff must be in there too, somewhere.